finding the button sometimes is the challenge.
Oh no, I definitely understand that, especially being virtual too. It's like, I hope you're here today. So
Yeah,
thank you so much for doing this for us. We greatly appreciate it.
you are most welcome. Thank you for asking. In behalf of the State Fire Marshal's Office and the Oregon Fire Marshal Association, we welcome everyone. My name is David Mills. I'm one of the Deputy State Fire Marshals here. My focus today is going to be primarily in the 2022 Oregon Fire Code, Chapter 7. And as you see on the screen, it's Part 1. In this time that we have allotted, I wasn't able to get through all of Chapter 7, so we're going to do a Part 2 in the coming months, sometime next year, to kind of wrap up Chapter 7. So as we go through this, we'll focus on some things, other things we will just catch in the next presentation. During this time, I think Sherry Barrett with our office is available to monitor the chat, and we're happy to field questions at the end of this presentation. So you might want to just jot those down as we're going through them. Primarily, we're going to deal in Chapter 7, the requirements for inspection and maintenance of existing, and we're going to deal today with passive fire protection features as we inspect existing buildings and structures. In general, these requirements are intended to maintain the required fire-resistant ratings and limit the spread of fire and smoke in the buildings. Chapter 7 is divided into 8 sections. We're going to deal with sections 701, the administrative side, and the definitions, 702. The remainder of Chapter 7 really does get into a lot of the meat of the chapter. Section 703 deals with penetrations, both membrane and through penetrations. 704, the joints and voids that are in buildings. 705, doors and window openings. 706, ducts and air for openings. 707 deals with concealed spaces, and section 708 is the intumescent sprayed applied materials you may see in some buildings. As I mentioned, we will get into sections 703 through 708 in the future lunch and learn that we will have. So in the fire code, I kind of categorize these into 5 key elements of a passive fire resistance rated construction. And the code outlines these 5 items, and you can see them on your screen there. Structural members, exterior walls. Number 3 is firewalls, fire barriers, and fire partitions. Number 4, horizontal assemblies. And number 5, shaft enclosures. We're going to take a moment and look at each one of these in detail. But before we do that, what I wanted to do is kind of define in chapter 702 a couple key definitions. What is fire resistance and what is a fire resistance rating? On the screen, you can read what is up there. But basically, when we're speaking of fire resistance and the resistance rating, as well as the Oregon Fire Code. To better understand this, fire resistance rating, to better understand fire resistance, let's talk about a couple different materials. A sheet of plywood has a low level of fire resistance compared to a concrete block, which has a higher level of fire resistance. The fire resistance of a material or an assembly is evaluated in the code using one of the primary test standards, ASTM E119. And on the screen, you can kind of see an example of the actual test oven, the E119 test oven, where products are put kind of through a torture test. And at the end, stream is applied, and then they're evaluated to see if they have passed the test. E119 has been around for a long time, and it's well recognized as the standard for building construction, fire resistance standard. The resistance rating is then assigned a time period, and not everything has the same time periods of how long it has passed through the oven and then the hose stream. And both of these definitions, as I mentioned, are outlined in the Oregon Structural Specialty Code as well as the Oregon Fire Code. So let's take a look at some of the things you and I would find in an existing building. We may walk into an existing building that has structural steel columns, beams, girders, and there may be sprayed applied fireproofing. Those items have been verified at the time of construction. In the case of sprayed applied fireproofing, it's a special inspection that's done by qualified individuals that then certify to the building department that proper thicknesses and the proper method of coating the steel has been done. When you and I go and inspect an existing building, similar to the picture, small picture to the left on the screen, we may find that there are cases where existing material has been removed for one reason or another. Probably in my experience, one of the most common things that happens is that sprinklers or something has been added to the building and they needed to clamp or attach to these beams. And so they'll scrape off an area and they may forget to come back and patch it. Well, manufacturers make patching kits for these that the owner can buy, and then the company will certify individuals, companies themselves and people to go and reapply and patch these. Monocoat has it, Cavco has it, and others. So they're easy to fix. It's not a big deal. They come in little 5-gallon buckets and they can slap it back on there and patch that spot. So if you come across it, note it, and it can be repaired relatively easily. When we're dealing with structural members, another common way of protecting them is with gypsum wallboard, drywall, sheetrock. And when structural members are protected for a fire resistive rating, the number of layers and how they're applied is important. UL Gypsum Association have listed assemblies of how it's to be applied. And so as you come across these and the drywall gypsum wallboard is damaged, there are ways to patch them and to repair them. We'll get a little more into that when we deal with walls. The last item that I commonly see as structural members that are given a protection on steel is an intumescent material, a paint that is applied. We've come across this a couple times where they didn't like the appearance of the monocoat or sprayed applied fireproofing. They'd like something a little, if you will, cleaner in appearance and one that they can paint over. So there is product on the market to protect steel. It's referred to as an intumescent fire resistant material. And in the slide on the picture on the left, you see that the steel is to first have a primer applied, then the intumescent coating is applied, and then more often than not, an approved top coat of some kind of enamel paint is applied. And the enamel paint really just provides a weather check for that. It's the intumescent coating that you're concerned with. So in the picture on the right, if you happen to come across some steel and this is flaking off, you'll want the owner to have a qualified contractor come out and take a look and see if that is damaging the intumescent coating. If it is, it needs to be reapplied. And in the fire code, in section 708 that we'll talk on the next go around. We'll get into the specific requirements of that. Other structural members that we most commonly see is wood products. And there are times when the wood needs to have a fire resistive. I've seen several systems. I've listed a few here in this slide. You can clad the wooden structure with like a cement board material. You can apply, in some cases, a mineral wool fiber board over the wood to give it a fire resistive rating. They do make on the market some very proprietary mortars and rendering materials that is applied to the surface of wood that will give it a fire resistive rating. And then the last, there are some thermal barrier coatings or intumescent paints that can be applied to wood. As the product I show here, it's relatively clear. You wouldn't even know it's on there, but you can see the wood grains through it. This product does provide a 1 hour fire resistive rating. So there are products out on the market that can do this. You would need to know that at the time of inspection, and hopefully the building owner will know this, and if not, your building department does, you can always check with them. In the list of items, the second item of the passive fire resistant rated construction is exterior walls. Often exterior walls are asymmetric, meaning they're unbalanced. The fire resistiveness is applied generally to one side, but they're tested as a unit, as a composite. And so if you come across exterior walls that are required to be fire resistive and they're damaged, you need to note that and have them repair in accordance with its original listing. That's important to follow, of when it was originally constructed and to that standard. The third item in our list actually has 3 components to it: fire walls, fire barriers, and fire partitions. We'll take a look at each one here. In the fire wall arrangement, these are the most fire resistive elements that we generally put in buildings. A fire wall is designed primarily to take and separate and make one building into technically 2 buildings. If I have one large building and I put a firewall down the middle, I have created 2 buildings for the purpose of the application of the building and fire code. I could sprinkler one side and not sprinkler the other. I can detect one side and not detect the other. They are, with a firewall, creating 2 separate buildings. Sometimes they're required. The most common example of a firewall that I see is when the building is built of different types of construction. The type of construction refers to the physical materials the building is made out of: the steel, iron, concrete, masonry, wood. And when you mix those, the building code will tell you you may have to separate them in the process. That separation is a wall, a firewall. And the firewall, they can be challenging to build, but they allow you to have greater building square footage, and the allowable area increases. They are to run from the foundation all the way to the roof, and in many cases through the roof. And in those cases, probably one of the telltale signs that you have in a firewall is these little, in the picture to the left there, these little supporting elements that crop out from the exterior of the building or on the top of the roof, referred to as parapets. They rise above the roof. These parapets generally around 30 inches, but can be taller. and they extend above the roof. And that's indicative of a firewall in a building. So if you see that from the exterior, then you know that you have a firewall in the building. The next item in this is fire barriers. Not as restricted as a firewall, but are very useful. They do need to go from the floor through the ceiling to the structure. They are made of non-combustible materials. So in fire barriers, they're not made of wood. And they're made to separate occupancies. In the building code, they're found in section 707. And one important item of a fire barrier is these fire barriers, whatever the rating of this barrier happens to be, 1, 2, 3, or 4 hour, whatever is supporting that barrier, this floor ceiling assembly, if you will, in a multi-story building. If the barrier is 2 hours, please note that the floor assembly supporting it is also 2 hours. They match up. It can be greater, could be a 3 hour, 4 hour floor ceiling assembly, but it at least is equivalent to the wall in which it's holding up. The last of the three is the fire partition. Fire partition, as you kind of see in our graphic here, starts at the floor, but need not go to the next floor above. It could stop at a ceiling, but it'll terminate at a fire rated ceiling, where in the previous one, the barrier would go all the way through. The partition need not. It can be made of wood. And quite common, these are used in corridors, dwelling unit separations, things like that. So to kind of summarize these three aspects of firewalls, fire barriers, and fire partitions, they all have a fire resistive rated material. They're all constructed of something that will resist. Their openings, doors, windows, and dampers are all protected, meaning they're rated also. They are walls, and they are built to a wall assembly. And in the E119 criteria, that makes a difference of how they are tested. Fire walls are vertical in nature. Fire barriers are vertical in nature. But a fire partition can take any shape or form. It can go vertical and then it can turn horizontal. It can go back to vertical and go horizontal again. Typically, fire partitions in the corridor are used in what we call tunnel construction, where the corridor wall will go up above a ceiling, and then horizontally, that same wall, it just turns on its side, goes horizontally, and then comes right back down on the other side. So they are allowed, fire partitions, to do that. And then for structural stability, it is the firewall that has to structurally be able to withstand that when this wall is dividing two buildings, that the building on one side can totally collapse and fail, and the wall structurally stays in place. It's a unique concept of firewalls. Fire barriers can fail much earlier, and fire partitions certainly do. But it's the firewall that must remain structurally stable when separating different buildings. Number 4 on our list is horizontal assemblies. In buildings, these are floor ceiling or roof ceiling assemblies. In the picture that is on the screen, it's representative of a typical floor ceiling assembly where there is wood, in this case, wood trusses, but they could be metal. In that case, there are listed fire resistive floor ceiling assemblies in both. A sheathing material is normally on the top. Truss depth does matter. In the case of wood, it's structural, the strong backs, if you will, holding those rows of trusses together is important. Insulation in this is key. It dissipates the heat. And I've seen in some cases where designers didn't think the insulation was needed between two conditioned spaces, between the, say, the second and third floor in the building. But for the fire rated aspect, it is. So that's important to know why it's there. It's part of its listing. And then finally, that layer of protection that's on the ceiling, if you will, is applied by either by multiple layers of gypsum wallboard, or sometimes special hangers or hooks are applied, and then the material is screwed onto that. And so this is kind of a generic one listed in the code. To really know how, if you have to make repairs, you would need to get with the UL listed assembly and know, and then they can, that company that developed it can assist you in how to patch or repair if you come across any of the damaged material there. Number 5 on the list is shaft enclosures. Shaft enclosures, sometimes referred to as vertical openings, they need to be properly protected. For when they're not, smoke, hot gases, and products of combustion travel through the building. Unprotected floor openings have been one of the major contributing factors in many large loss of life fires in the world. So in the code, shafts have certain requirements and ratings. Most commonly on the right is the elevator shaft. But there are also in multi-story buildings plumbing or electrical shafts. And when elements of that shaft, such as piping, come through the shaft wall, rated shaft wall arrangement, those penetrations need to be properly sealed. That concludes those 5 items outlined in section 701.2 entitled the fire resistant rated construction that you find in buildings. The next section in section 701.2.1 is a unique application and an arrangement. I don't know that we see a lot of this, but you need to be aware of it. And I'll just quickly read the code section here. The hanging and displaying of saleable goods and other decorative materials from acoustical ceiling systems, and here's the key, that are part of a fire resistant rated horizontal assembly shall be prohibited. Meaning, if the designer of the building wishes to protect those trusses, those joists, floor joists, ceiling joists, with a T-bar ceiling as kind of displayed in the picture on the right, nothing should be hung from them. These common little hooks for hanging elements off it, you should not have them if the ceiling system is part of a fire rated assembly. Most are not. Most typical, if you will, office buildings or of such that have the T-bar ceiling in it, that system is not rated. But if it is, and they do make 1 hour rated, I think even up to 2 hour rated acoustical tile ceilings, things like plants should not be hung from them. Signage should not be hung from them. Because what happens is you're doing a couple things. I don't know that the weight is that significant, but it could be in plants and things like that. But in the graphics shown here, the signs, probably not that big of a deal. But you had to drill into this. You had to run a wire, a hook or something into it. And you're introducing products of combustion, combustible products, closer to the ceiling than really what it was intended in the fire testing. So the rule is, again, I will emphasize this, it's not all suspended acoustical ceilings. It's only the ones that are part of a fire resistive rated assembly. When the actual T-bar ceiling, if you will, is fire rated, then you should not have anything suspended or hanging from those ceilings. And that is again found in section 701.21. The code has requirements for smoke barriers and smoke partitions. Much like the fire barrier and fire partitions, these deal with smoke. Smoke barriers are most commonly found in buildings where we're going to do some partial evacuation, a defend in place concept. In my example here, we have an I2 occupancy, a hospital. And on the floor, there is 2 smoke compartments. To divide that floor into 2 compartments, you place a smoke barrier. As you can see in the illustration in red here, the smoke barrier can make jogs through the building. It does go from floor to ceiling, but it will travel along and can go right and left and have jogs, but it goes from the exterior to exterior of the building. Smoke partitions are less fire resistive and less of a requirement. We normally see smoke partitions around openings, such as a stair, and these can be devices, such as this curtain material that just drops and seals off this stair that I will presume went through multiple floors. Smoke partitions do not have a fire rating, where fire barriers do have a fire rating and a smoke rating. They get both. The difference between the fire barrier being 1, 2, 3, or 4 hour is that the smoke barrier has the fire capabilities, but it has the added of smoke. So it's really sealed very well. And a lot of caulking and gasketing, as kind of in this picture that you see here, happens because it's really trying to stop primarily the smoke. So to summarize for smoke partitions, they still get sealed for smoke, but they really do not have a specified period of time for fire. We talked about maintenance. Maintenance is probably one of our biggest items, is that we will come across buildings and they've punched holes and to run different cabling through or to run ductwork or pipes. Know out there that when we need to patch a gypsum wallboard wall, the Gypsum Association has actually a repair guide. It's GA 225-08, I think is the latest. And they'll tell you how to patch a hole, if you will, in a fire rated wall. And they give you some of the framing requirements and the types of screws, and then the patch, and then they'll mud and tape over it. So there are specific ways to do it. We've come across probably in our inspections things where people have tried their best to, in this case, fire caulk. If it looks this ugly, it probably is incorrect, I'll just say. You would not want that much intumescent caulking around a damper, because when it expands, it could interfere with the closing of the damper. So there's proper assemblies, and we'll get into those in that part 2. But holes in the floor and pipes through walls. Generally, the concept is don't go through the firewalls, don't penetrate them. But they do at times need to be, and it happens. So in section 701.6, there is a section entitled Owner's Responsibility. So in buildings like this that have fire-rated assemblies and have a series of openings, doors, windows, dampers, and penetrations, they're to keep a log, an inventory of what they have. Most commonly, what's done is they'll take a picture of before and then they'll seal it after, and they'll keep a little log, is the right way of doing it. They'll take a picture of it, they'll give where it's at, the type of penetration it is, what is it? Is it gypsum wallboard? Is it a masonry wall? What's the rating? And what system they're going to use to repair that. And they'll sometimes give how big of the space it is and things like that. So section 701.6 does tell the owner to keep an inventory and allows us to ask for that inventory upon inspection. The next section, 701.7, is if you come across something that's unsafe. In my example here, we have a firewall and someone has just punched a hole through it. So an unsafe condition is one that has not been maintained, does not function as intended, does not have the fire resistance, or does not resist the passage of smoke. Those items make it unsafe and it needs to be repaired. I think we all agree in this picture, there probably was never intended to be an opening in this firewall in the attic, but they needed to, I'm going to guess, go from one side to the other. And so I'm going to say that now perhaps a rated door needs to go in. But they could come back and patch this with drywall, sheetrock, gypsum wallboard, following the gypsum wallboard criteria for the patch. Something that's not in the fire code that I have contemplated putting in the fire code, but is in the building code, the Oregon Structural Specialty Code, is that when these fire resistant rated walls and floor ceiling assemblies, primarily walls, are built, they are to mark them and identify them so that all the trades and other people who come into the building know that that's a fire rated wall and what hourly rating it is. So in the code, in the Oregon Structural Specialty Code, is a section that outlines in section 703.5. And it tells them where to place these little, if either signs or spray paint them. They need to be legible. I noticed the one on the right here. It's probably seen better days. And then I'm going to say their wall has seen better days. Again, I say, if it looks like this, you need to double check that it's been properly done. It's not that you don't check the one on the left, you do, but this one looks like they took some time and thought and did a really good job of protecting the openings there. The code has some requirements that the sign or the paint is to be located not visible to the public. So it's in the above the ceiling arrangement. The sign or the painting of the wall is at 30-foot intervals, located not more than 15 feet off each end. So you start at one end, go 15 feet, and then just every 30 feet have some indication of what it is, whether it's a 2-hour rated firewall or a 1-hour rated smoke barrier. They are to be identified. So that's quickly our lunch and learn for today. What I'd like to do is in the future do a part 2 and get into these elements of the fire resistive rated arrangement. Talk about penetrations and joints and voids and doors and windows and concealed spaces and the sprayed intumescent material. So we'll add to this part 1 with a part 2 in the coming months. So for now, that concludes my presentation. I know I've ended a little bit early and I apologize. Anne-Marie and I were talking, and Jessica with OFMA were talking about, we needed to have a little knowledge check to see how you guys, if you were kind of paying attention or eating your lunch during this time. So you'll get, OFMA is going to send out this PowerPoint to you. And at the end of it, I'm going to ask, we've asked some knowledge questions. Here's an example of one of the questions. You know, what historical event significantly influenced the development of modern fire codes in the United States? And I give 4 examples here. The Nakatomi Plaza building fire, Pearl skyscraper fire, the Towering Inferno fire, or was it the Triangle T-shirt factory fire? And then if you click through, you'll find that I've kind of given you the correct answer to this. So you'll get a series of questions at the end of the PowerPoint for you to answer. And then there is a little example for the questions. I've taken a detoxification center, Happy Days. It's a group I2 occupancy. And we're going to ask some questions of you. What walls go where in this arrangement? So I hope today's presentation was helpful. Give you a little insight. I believe Anne-Marie and OFMA are going to send out a survey of how this presentation was. Let us know how it went, what you liked, and what you think we could improve on. With that, Anne-Marie, I think I'll turn it back over to you, if that's okay. But if there are questions, I am happy to answer or do my best to provide an answer to any questions.
David, we do have a question in chat.
Okay.
Danny is asking if there is a recording to rewatch this information. And yes, this has been recorded and it will be given over to OFMA for them to send out as needed.
Great. Thank you, Sherry.
This is Sean Connon, the supervising deputy for the technical services unit. I know Anne-Marie was doing some inspections today and whatnot, so I don't believe she's back on. So as David Mills mentioned, please put your questions in the chat and we'll start kind of going through those because I've been monitoring the chat as well. So we got Danny's question.